Here's the second call to action, and this is where your thinking starts to stretch. So far, you've been introduced to exploration methods, thinking frameworks, and a few unconventional ways of looking at problems. Now comes the moment when those ideas stop being concepts and start becoming tools. The intent here is simple, but the impact can be profound. Take a situation you already understand and deliberately explore what small but meaningful changes could solve existing challenges or unlock benefits beyond what is currently visible. We'll lean on a framework you already know, but this time we'll use it not just to explain a situation, rather to probe it. To ask questions like, what if this element were different? What if this constraint were relaxed? What if one function were amplified, reduced, or repurposed? To ground this, we'll once again use the archery scenario, not because archery matters here, but because it's familiar. We'll build an exploratory view of its functions, features, and outcomes, and use that to practice how exploration actually works in a real-world-like context. That example will serve as a reference, helping you translate the same thinking into situations you're facing in your own environment. If you reach a point where you can confidently explore a scenario, surface its challenges, and identify directions that create outsized impact, then you've arrived exactly where this stage is meant to take you. Structured exploration that leads to meaningful innovation, focused on solving what truly matters. Let's take a moment to anchor ourselves before we move forward. You've seen this 8-part construct before, and at a glance it may look very familiar. But the intent this time is different, and that difference matters. Earlier, we used a similar construct to analyze inputs and functions, how inputs decompose, how they relate to functions, and how those relationships shape outcomes. This time, we're shifting the lens. Here, the construct is used for exploration, specifically to examine how functions or features translate into benefits and non-benefits. We are no longer asking what causes what, but rather what helps, what hurts, and what could be changed to improve the situation. That shift is what prepares the ground for meaningful exploration. So let's quickly revisit what this 8-part construct looks like, just to ensure everyone is oriented. At its core, this framework asks you to look at 8 distinct aspects of a scenario. Out of these 8 parts, 4 belong to what we call the outcome domain. This is where benefits and non-benefits show up. Layered on top of this is another critical dimension: time. Out of the 8 parts, 4 are time domain areas, 2 related to features and 2 related to outcomes. These are used when either features or outcomes evolve over time. So the framework helps you see not just what exists, but also what changes and how those changes matter. In addition, there is a space to explicitly recognize what remains constant and neutral, things that don't change and don't tilt the situation positively or negatively, but still define the boundary conditions of the scenario. Now let's walk through the structure itself. Start on the right-hand side of the construct. These areas focus on features and outcomes that are not time-dependent. Just above the x-axis, you have the area for advantageous features. This is where you plot functions or features that clearly contribute to positive outcomes. Just below the x-axis, you have disadvantageous features, features or functions that directly lead to negative or undesired outcomes. Adjacent to these, still on the right-hand side, are the outcome domain areas. The upper right quadrant is for advantageous outcomes, the benefits you actually experience. The lower right quadrant is for disadvantageous outcomes, the costs, drawbacks, or negative effects that result. Now shift your attention to the left-hand side of the construct. All 4 areas here belong to the time domain. These are used when features or outcomes vary with time. The two areas adjacent to the x-axis represent time-dependent features. Above the x-axis, you plot advantageous time-dependent features, features that improve the situation as they evolve. Below the x-axis, you plot disadvantageous time-dependent features, features whose evolution creates increasing challenges. Finally, the top left and bottom left areas represent time-dependent outcomes. The top left is for advantageous time-dependent outcomes, where benefits grow or emerge over time. The bottom left is for disadvantageous time-dependent outcomes, where negative effects worsen or accumulate as time passes. Once you plot functions, features, and their corresponding outcomes across this construct, something powerful happens. Patterns begin to emerge. You can clearly see what deserves attention, what is already working, what is quietly hurting the system, and where small changes could unlock disproportionate benefits. That clarity is exactly what this framework is designed to give you. And now, with that understanding in place, let's figure out how we can trigger the exploratory thinking from here. Now, this is where exploration truly begins. Once you've plotted everything on the framework, the real trigger for innovation doesn't come from what's working well. It comes from the tough questions you're willing to ask. And those questions almost always emerge from the parts of the framework that clearly qualify as disadvantageous to the scenario under discussion. Start with the features or functions that directly lead to disadvantageous outcomes. When you see something sitting there, don't rush to remove it. Pause and ask, is there a way to suppress this feature or at least its impact without damaging the overall effectiveness of the scenario? If suppression isn't feasible, then explore a second question. Can this disadvantage be complemented with something else that neutralizes its effect? Sometimes the solution isn't elimination, it's balance. Apply the same line of thinking to the disadvantageous outcomes themselves, the ones plotted just below the x-axis on the right side. Ask, is there a way to win over this outcome? Can its severity be reduced, its frequency lowered, or its impact softened by adding a compensating element elsewhere in the system? Now shift your focus to the time-dependent disadvantageous features. These are especially important because timing often determines whether a challenge becomes manageable or overwhelming. For disadvantageous features or functions that worsen over time, ask not only how can this be reduced, but also when does it hurt the most? Is there a way to redesign the scenario so it operates outside the peak negative window? Or can the negative effect be temporarily suppressed, buffered, or absorbed during critical periods? The same thinking applies to time-dependent disadvantageous outcomes. If the challenge cannot be eliminated entirely, then consistency becomes the goal. Explore ways to continuously manage the impact, or, if that fails, ways to avoid the periods where the damage is highest. Sometimes winning isn't about confronting the problem head-on, but about reshaping the conditions under which it operates. At its core, this exploration is about turning disadvantages into signals. Every qualified disadvantage, whether static or time-dependent, marks an opportunity to think differently, to reconfigure, to add leverage. This is how edge is created in real-world scenarios, not by ignoring challenges, but by using them as the starting point for smarter, more resilient solutions. All right, now let's bring this exploration framework to life using our familiar archery scenario. We begin by laying out the advantages and disadvantages, both on the features side and the outcomes side, so that the entire situation becomes visible at once. When you do this properly, you're no longer guessing where the problem is. You're looking straight at it. Start with the advantageous features. In archery, one of the strongest advantages is the archer's ability to identify and engage the target through sight or sound. This capability directly enables the act of aiming and shooting, and it clearly contributes to better performance. On the other hand, we also have disadvantageous features. A good example is the blowing breeze or environmental variation. This feature is external to the archer, but it directly interferes with arrow trajectory and introduces instability into the scenario. Now move to the outcomes. The primary advantageous outcome here is reliable accuracy, the archer consistently hitting the target. That's the result we want the entire system to optimize for. But not all outcomes are favorable. Some challenges don't come from everyday conditions. They emerge in specific contexts. For instance, when archery is used in battle scenarios involving impenetrable armor, arrows fail to achieve their intended effect. Even with perfect aim, the outcome becomes disadvantageous because the arrows can't deliver impact. That's a clear disadvantageous outcome, independent of skill. Next, let's layer in time. Over time, continuous practice and continuous improvement act as strong, advantageous, time-dependent features. The more the archer practices, the better their control, judgment, and consistency become. However, time introduces trade-offs as well. Exhaustive practice has a cost: fatigue, physical strain, and resource consumption, which makes it a disadvantageous time-dependent feature. Finally, consider time-dependent disadvantageous outcomes, challenges that arise only when the context changes over time. A powerful example is archery on horseback. Here, maintaining accuracy becomes significantly harder due to motion, balance, and coordination. The same skill set now produces weaker results because the operating conditions have changed. Once all 8 parts, advantages, disadvantages, features, outcomes, and their time-dependent counterparts are plotted, something important happens. The entire scenario is laid out clearly in front of us. We can now see not just what works and what doesn't, but where the real friction lies. And that clarity is exactly what prepares us for the next step: meaningful exploration, intelligent trade-offs, and creative solutions that actually move the needle. Now that the challenges are clearly visible, this is where exploration truly begins. This is the moment where we stop describing the problem and start asking what could be changed. Let's start with the blowing breeze, the factor that keeps catching the archer off guard. Once we recognize it as a disadvantageous feature, the exploration trigger naturally kicks in. One possible direction is instrumentation. What if there were a mechanism or tool that could monitor wind direction and intensity and give the archer a real-time hint on how to adjust the shot? Another direction is design innovation. Perhaps different arrows could be crafted for different wind conditions. Some arrows might be optimized to cut through the breeze, while others could actually leverage the wind to the archer's advantage. But here's the important discipline in exploration: a solution cannot be evaluated in isolation. If we design arrows that handle wind better, we must ensure they don't worsen another challenge if the same could coexist in certain situations, like failing against impenetrable armor while also dealing with blowing breeze. Real-world scenarios rarely present challenges one at a time. Solutions need to coexist as much possible, otherwise they need to be separated as different concerns. Such constraints sharpen innovation. There's also a third, often underestimated solution path: human capability. Training the archer to read environmental cues and adapt intuitively can outperform many tools, especially when dealing with complex dynamic conditions. Human cognition, when honed through expertise, is an incredibly powerful adaptive system. And now we can clearly see why this is an exploration topic. We understand the problem, the constraints, and what must not be broken while fixing it. Now let's move to the challenge of impenetrable armor. This clearly calls for fundamental innovation in bow and arrow design, greater force transfer, different materials, or alternative mechanics. But here we hit an important realization. It may not be realistic to solve this challenge and horseback archery with the exact same solution. That's okay. Exploration is not about forcing a single answer. It's about coherent combinations. Separate solutions can exist, as long as together they raise overall effectiveness. So for horseback archery, the solution direction looks different. Here, stability, balance, and timing dominate. A blend of bow design innovation and exceptionally high skill levels might be the only viable path. This tells us something crucial. Some challenges are tool heavy, some are skill heavy, and some demand both. Finally, let's look at the cost of exhaustive practice. Practice improves outcomes, but it also consumes time, energy, and resources. That naturally raises the exploration question. Can we reduce this cost? Is there a way to simplify the mechanics of shooting so that reasonable accuracy can be achieved with less effort? Perhaps an innovation that reduces complexity, improves guidance, or stabilizes execution. In fact, we may already know of such an invention, but the point here isn't the answer. The point is recognizing where innovation is needed and why. Taken together, this is how exploration threads emerge. Each disadvantage becomes a doorway to possibility. Each constraint shapes the solution space, and innovation stops being random. It becomes purposeful, grounded, and coherent. This is exactly the kind of thinking that turns structured analysis into real-world impact. As we close this segment, the takeaway is not about the framework itself, but about the shift it enables in how you think. You've seen how exploration begins by making challenges explicit, then deliberately testing how changes, small or bold, reshape outcomes. This is the transition from analysis to imagination, from understanding what is to investigating what could be. When you learn to explore with structure, constraints stop being blockers and start becoming guides for innovation. That is the capability this stage is meant to build. The confidence to question assumptions, experiment thoughtfully, and uncover pathways that create real leverage, so that when you step into your own scenarios, you are not guessing but exploring with intent.